My dearest brothers and sisters. This is Hakann speaking. Today I would like to discuss the patriarchy. I also would like to discuss the believe the chief pattern. Most people don't even realize this pattern exists, yet it is absolutely critical to be aware of if you want to understand why the world is as it is. This message will be a bit heavy and it will discuss sexual violence, so if you don't want to read about that, it's best to skip this message. Section: The Patriarchy. After the fall of Atlantis, Earth humans spent a lot of time living in primitive tribes. Almost certainly you have ancestral memories and unresolved ancestral emotions from that time too. Those primitive tribes were often led by one or a few chiefs. Unfortunately, often these chiefs were negative galactics, who either led the tribe in their own form or in a human form. Even if these tribes were led by humans, then often these chiefs listened to the whisperings of negative galactics that they should dominate and they should take whatever they want. In other cases, good-hearted human chiefs were literally possessed or replaced by negative galactics. Some of you may have ancestral memories of your tribal chief who suddenly started behaving in a dark way. Or if a chief could not be easily corrupted or possessed, often his or her tribe was simply conquered and taken over through tribal warfare. Hence, in a lot of cases, primitive tribes were either directly led by a negative galactic, either in their own form or in a human form, or they were led by a human who was heavily influenced or controlled by a negative galactic. In a lot of cases, these negative galactics were unevolved reptilians. Now, a minority of reptilians are evolved and kind-hearted, such as Hakann, who has shared messages via this channeler in the past. However, the average reptilian is unevolved. And these beings just take what they want, including sexually. Reptilians see women as nothing more than walking vaginas and walking wombs, and they feel that women should be owned and treated as property. They feel that virginity and youth and beauty and obedience are the only things that matter in women. In their minds, there are no female qualities other than virginity and youth and beauty and obedience. Reptilians feel that it is good for society when so-called owners, them, use their women's whenever they want, in whichever way they want. Reptilians feel that empowered women, or even women who say more words than yes sir, can cause the downfall of society and the downfall of powerful men. Hence reptilians feel that it is good for society that owners regularly use physical and sexual violence to keep women down, not just when women so-called misbehave, but also preventatively. Of course none of these things are actually true. I'm just saying that this is how unevolved reptilians view the world. Also, often a male reptilian is expected to rape a woman as part of his coming-of-age process. If he refuses, he never becomes a man, which usually leads to some powerful reptilian enslaving him. Needless to say, this patriarchy was utterly traumatic for human women. My sisters, I'm so sorry this awful stuff happened to you. You didn't deserve any of this. Frankly, even though I didn't make this retreat decision, I still feel some amount of shame that after the fall of Atlantis, us positive galactics more or less retreated and just let this happen. It is understandable that women, even today, haven't dealt with the ancestral trauma of the patriarchy. And hence it is understandable that even today, women speak out against the patriarchy. However, it is important to realize what the patriarchy actually is. Despite what your dictionaries may say, the patriarchy is mostly reptilian men, plus a few human men, raping women and keeping women down over a period of millennia, back in the day of primitive tribes. That is the experience that is causing the emotional reaction, the hostility towards the patriarchy and the sometimes visceral hostility to men in positions of power. So long as people think that the patriarchy is women in 2023 being subtly discriminated against or not paid enough or not taken seriously or kept out of positions of power, then they will never get over the trauma of the actual patriarchy. Because to get over a trauma you need to look it squarely in the eyes. If people don't even realize what's causing them emotional pain, then they will never get over that pain. Instead of people dealing with the trauma of the actual patriarchy, we see people trying to fix this imaginary 2023 patriarchy by, for example, introducing women-only quotas. First of all, that actually deeply hurts men. And second, even if you create a situation where more women go to university, more women are CEOs and women earn more on average than men, even then the patriarchy wound will still be bleeding and unconscious people will still demand yet more measures against the patriarchy. Because their trauma of the actual, primitive tribe patriarchy will not be resolved unless people face it directly. No amount of women-only quotas is a substitute for people observing their ancestral pain of being controlled, raped, kept down and being powerless about that. So how do you face that pain directly? Well, if you don't feel any particular pain or resistance with regards to men being in positions of power, or women being oppressed, then you don't necessarily need to do anything. If you do feel that, you can think or say, I wish to observe my trauma surrounding men abusing their power and my trauma surrounding women being oppressed. Then observe whatever comes up. If nothing comes up, do more general spiritual work first and then maybe repeat that sentence a bit later. To be clear, in some cases, women in 2023 really are treated poorly. But well, average men are also treated poorly, in different ways. From my perspective, women and men are both treated poorly, and the solution isn't female-only scholarships or female-only quotas. The solution is for women and men to come together and build a better society for everyone. Fortunately, the actual patriarchy is over. Reptilians are no longer structurally raping and owning and torturing and keeping down and discriminating against women, as they did during the days of primitive tribes. So if you feel strong emotions when you think about female oppression or about the patriarchy or about women being discriminated against, then it can be good to sit down and observe that internal pain, rather than try to change the external world. Healing yourself first, and trying to change the external world second, is nearly always the wiser way of doing things. Section: How the Patriarchy Affects Dating Today. If you are a woman and you find yourself being attracted to psychopaths or criminals or murderers or controlling or destructive or self-destructive men, then that too can be a relic of the unresolved and unintegrated experience of being controlled by reptilians for millennia. After all, during those times, you were controlled by and regularly had sex with men who were psychopaths, criminals, murderers, controllers, destructive or self-destructive. You may have some Stockholm-like syndrome from that. Or you may simply unconsciously wish to repeat your trauma, as trauma victims often do, in the hope of finding resolution. This repeat the trauma in the hope of finding resolution pattern often looks like this. The woman finds a man who is dangerous, wild, unstable, a criminal, self-destructive, or something like that. And she dates him and tries to turn him into a non-destructive man who respects her, in the unconscious hope of fixing the trauma that in ancestral times a destructive man owned her and didn't respect her. However, tragically, this very often only leads to further pain. There's a good chance that the destructive man keeps being destructive and that she gets hurt in the process. And even if she succeeds in turning this man into a non-destructive man, it's quite possible that this doesn't resolve her trauma, because she still hasn't actually observed her ancestral pain. And so she dumps the now non-destructive man, finds another destructive man and begins the cycle all over again. This is why men sometimes complain that their girlfriend first convinces them to discard all their wild and slightly dangerous and slightly self-destructive edges, and then the girlfriend loses interest and dumps him. If you're a woman, your unresolved pain may manifest as you having a rape fantasy, or you wanting to again be with destructive or controlling men. However, being with such men is not the actual solution. The actual solution is sitting down and observing your old pain, which includes your own unresolved ancestral trauma of being controlled and raped by such men. If you feel resentment or hostility towards men, the solution may very well be dealing with the pain of this period of patriarchy during primitive times. To be clear, it's not natural for humans, whether men or women, to be attracted to people who are psychopathic, criminal, murderous, controlling, destructive or self-destructive. Pleiadian humans don't find those qualities to be attractive. I've also never met a Pleiadian human who had a rape fantasy, and keep in mind that I'm a mind reader living in a society with zero sexual shame. I'm quite aware of all the sexual fantasies of my friends, and my friends have some wild sexual fantasies indeed, but none of them are rape fantasies. So if you find yourself attracted to controlling or psychopathic or destructive or self-destructive people, then you may want to work on that. The stereotype here is a woman going for a bad boy, but there are also men who are drawn to controlling or unstable women, which again may very well be unresolved trauma from ancient times. Non-Earth humans don't find those to be attractive qualities in women. BDSM or SM or kink are also methods that people use to cope with their ancestral trauma. Although there is slightly more at play with BDSM than just ancestral trauma. Still, it plays a big role. To be clear, I'm not saying that people are bad for having these desires or preferences. I'm just saying that these are quite likely to be unresolved trauma from ancient times. If these things get in the way of having a fulfilling love life, then you might want to look at that. But it's ultimately up to you if you want to look at this ancestral trauma or not. If you don't, you're still a divine fractal of Source, and you are still infinitely deserving of love. And yes, if men are curious why Earth women may say one thing but then often go for bad boys, for drug users, for psychopaths, for criminals, for men who control or beat women, well, this is one part of why that is. It's traumatized people unconsciously repeating their trauma. If you are a man and you are not naturally controlling or destructive or self-destructive, then it is best to find an Earth woman who isn't going for those things. Those women are out there. Of course, not all women and not all men are like this. This was the discussion of the patriarchy and its effects on modern dating. Let's move on to the second part of this message. Section: the Believe the Chief Pattern. Primitive chiefs, whether they were literally reptilians or strongly influenced by reptilians, didn't only feel that it was good for society to keep women down. They also felt that it was good for society if the strong, them, have the right to be served and obeyed by the weak, humans. Even if the weak merely disagree with them, they see that as sort of a crime against the natural order, in the same way that humans have an ick reaction if they think about a parent having sex with their child, or a sister having sex with her biological brother. Unevolved reptilians have a similar reaction of disgust at the thought of having a weak human disagreeing with them. So if a human did, that human was often tortured, raped, murdered or exiled. At times, their families faced a similar fate. Hence, most people have been brutally conditioned that they should simply believe what authority figures say, and not think whether that's true or false. Because thinking critically is literally dangerous, for themselves and for their family members. This also meant that if your friend or family member said something that ran counter to what the leaders said, that the best thing you can do for them is convince them to adopt the worldview of the leaders instead. Again, it's not about who is right, it's about that your friend or family member, and their family, will be beaten, raped, murdered or exiled if they disagree with the leaders. Or if you can't convince your friend or family member to change their worldview, then the best thing you can do for them is to try to silence and censor them, so that no one finds out that they disagree with the leaders. And thus, they won't be beaten, etc. This pattern still goes on today. Of course it does, because the vast majority of Earth humans don't even realize that this pattern exists. How can Earth humans evolve beyond something that they are not even aware of? And so, even today, people try to tell their friends and family and other people to ditch their worldview and adopt the worldview of their leaders, which today is the worldview of their governments and the media. Or if they can't convince them, they try to get those people censored or deplatformed. Because after all, that is how you help that person and their family to remain safe. This is why messages that run counter to what the government says, are often described as dangerous or harmful or as, you can't say that, people might die. Even if objectively speaking, the message isn't actually harmful, and there's not really a significant chance that people will die. And even if there's a risk that someone could die, then that's actually a lot less strong of an argument than it sounds like, because every single day people die in traffic accidents, and yet no one says, we should ban cars, otherwise people might die. In these cases, it's not so much about the actual risk of the message itself. It's more that ancestral memories are invoked that if people disagree with their leaders, then they and possibly their loved ones may get brutalized or murdered. From the perspective of people not on the left, it frequently looks absolutely ridiculous when left-wingers claim that something relatively harmless is dangerous or that people might die. To the left-wingers themselves, however, the risk feels very real that people might die. And so they speak up, out of love and care for their fellow man. You may notice that if you sit down with an unawake friend or family member and point out lies of the government or the media, or point out things that don't make sense in the official narrative, that you often literally get a fear reaction. They're often not rationally considering your words. If they were, they would ask for more information or sources, they would do their own research, or they would present rational counterarguments, and them citing mainstream media is not a rational counterargument to the claim that mainstream media itself is corrupt. Instead, they often have a fear reaction, and either they reply with a regurgitated thought-terminating talking point, or they just cut off the discussion. Even though you would think that if their friend or family member had a different worldview from them, that this would be worth actually discussing. Instead, you don't get a discussion and you get a fear reaction instead. Where does this fear come from? It comes from the ancestral memories of them not believing the chief and being horribly punished as a result. Hence the fear reaction when you say something that contradicts the chief, in this case government and media. One reason why some people wake up to the fact that governments are acting against their citizens, and others do not, is that some people have simply been brutalized much more by governments in past lives than other people. Hopefully this will help you feel compassion for those who have not yet woken up to that fact. Now, does it make sense why some families cut off contact with people who have opinions that strongly run against government narratives? In ancestral times, this was a way in which families could try to keep themselves safe from the retribution of the leaders. As in, the leader might only brutalize the person with the wrong opinion, but not his family, because his family cut off contact with him and thus clearly signaled that they disagreed with the dissident. Maybe this is not a nice thing to do, but well, sometimes families needed to do this in order to not get murdered. In a way, the average person who still trusts the government in 2023 is more or less in an abusive relationship with the government, in the sense that they do what the government says, even though often this is not good for them. Note that there's often no real love there. Even left-wing Americans who voted for Joe Biden often don't really love Biden. Hence it's not love, it's more like an abusive relationship, based on the ancestral trauma of we need to believe the chief in order to remain safe. Just like how people often don't realize they're in an abusive relationship with a person, people also often don't realize that they're in a sort of abusive relationship with the government. This believe the chief, or he'll beat you, pattern plays a bigger role than so-called virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is the idea that left-wing people only say left-wing things in order to signal their virtue to other left-wingers. Now, this sometimes plays a part. But what's more important is the ancestral pattern that people fear that if Joe disagrees with his leaders, then Joe and possibly Joe's family will be murdered. And thus people try to tell Joe to adopt the correct opinions, for the safety of him and his family. Of course, in 2023, in many countries you can have an opinion that runs counter to government narratives and government agents won't beat you up or murder you. And people who follow government narratives because they're under the influence of this believe the chief pattern aren't literally thinking that they need to obey the government or they'll be murdered. However, most people first subconsciously decide what they are going to do, and only then come up with a rationalization for their actions. It happens all the time that why people actually do something has very little to do with why they think they are doing something. In reality, this ancestral believe the chief pattern often does play a huge part in why people believe or truth the government. And it's not solely ancestral fear. Right now, at this very moment, a few Earth humans are being tortured by government agents for disagreeing with their government, and this affects every single human worldwide via the collective subconscious, making them more afraid of the thought of disobeying the government. This believe the chief pattern causes people to want others to not disagree with their leaders, for the safety of them and their families. This trauma has not yet been resolved in humanity. Also note that this is just one mostly past life pattern that still strongly affects people today. There are others too. Once you advance far enough in your personal healing journey, you will start healing not just the trauma from this life but also the trauma from past lives, and in many cases you will be surprised how much of your current behavior was determined by past life trauma. And of course, other humans too are strongly influenced by past life trauma, especially if they are unaware of their past life trauma. Let's return to looking just at the believe the chief pattern. Why does this pattern seem to come up now, and not in say 1960? Well, right now the government's policies are much more strongly anti-people than they were in 1960. Also, people now are in general more awake and higher consciousness than they were in 1960, which means that they are more able to see through the lies of the government. Plus we have the internet now, which facilitates research and makes it so that government lies are more easily exposed, and people who disagree with the government can more easily find like-minded people and convince themselves that they are not crazy. So, if you disagree with or distrust the government, it's quite likely you are correct. A few so-called conspiracy theories are false, but most are true. Note that almost everyone has a huge bias in favor of believing in the government, due to ancestral trauma. I would like to remind people that they are fundamentally reincarnating souls. Your body is just the vehicle through which your soul has a few experiences. And almost certainly your soul doesn't care that much about the safety of its current vehicle. Almost certainly your soul cares much more that you and others are freely able to have experiences and form their own opinions. Some right-wingers have accused mainstream left-wing politics of being current thingism. As in, right-wingers say that mainstream left-wing politics doesn't operate from fundamental values, but it simply cares about following whatever the current thing is. As an example, right-wingers may point out that one day left-wingers will call on bodily autonomy and say, "My body, my choice." But then when other people call on bodily autonomy in order to say, "I refuse the COVID injection and I don't want to be excluded from society as a result," then left-wingers drop the value of bodily autonomy. To an extent this is true. Left-wingers often do care about current thingism. This is explained by this believe the chief pattern that we have been talking about. Left-wingers often operate out of an unconscious fear that if people disagree with the government, then people suffer or die. Hence, if the government now says X, then left-wingers immediately start promoting X, consistency or principles or values be damned, because now people need to believe X or people will suffer or die. However, from another perspective, left-wingers do have one central value that they are loyal to, and this value is love. Because often left-wingers genuinely are subconsciously guided by the principle that if their friend doesn't believe the chief, then they get murdered, and surely it's a loving act to try and save your friend's life. Still, note that this is an unintegrated form of love. Or rather, it is a form of love that lacks corresponding wisdom and strength. Because a loving, but also wise and strong person would not blindly act out of an ancestral believe the chief pattern. And yet, it is love. It is just slightly misguided love. Of course, not every left-wingers is like this. A pretty good way to separate the left-winger who acts out the believe the chief pattern versus a left-winger who thinks for themselves is to ask if the left-winger accepts all the current left-wing talking points and principles, i.e. if the left-winger engages in current thingism. We should send weapons to Ukraine, immigration is good, my body my choice but also COVID mandates, we should have quotas for women and minorities, censoring right-wingers is good, we should make economically painful to very painful changes to save the environment, etc. One example of a left-winger who doesn't accept all the current left-wing talking points is Noam Chomsky, who has spoken out against censoring people even if he strongly disagrees with them. This is a sign that he's not operating out of a believe the chief pattern. Left-wingers often do try to make the world a better place and do try to help others, even if they act out the believe the chief pattern. In a way, you could argue that this is a nobler motivation than the common right-wing motivation of freedom and leave me alone and let me live my life. It's just that in practice, left-wingers often are manipulated by dark controller globalists. After all, if dark controller globalists tell their government puppets to tell their population that X is good, then left-wingers will generally be in favor of X due to this believe the chief pattern, and generally X is something that's bad for humanity. And so, in practice, left-wingers often get used by globalist dark controllers for things that ultimately harm humanity, even though ultimately they genuinely are trying to help people. Meanwhile, the common right-wing motivation of freedom and leave me alone inherently runs against the interests of the dark controller globalists, because you can't create a global tyranny if the citizens insist on being left alone and being free. And so in practice, right-wingers today are often on the right side, or if you are cynical, right-wingers just happen to usually be on the right side at this particular moment in time, because of their anti-globalism stance. Some galactics do feel that some Earth right-wingers should do more to help other people or to help nature, although we're not in favor of forcing anyone to help other people. Forcing people to do anything is often counterproductive in practice, even if you think you are forcing people to do something good. A number of galactics also appreciate that more left-wingers are vegetarian than right-wingers are. Of course, I am greatly generalizing here, both about people and about left-wing and right-wing politics. To be clear, I am not advocating that people engage in partisan politics. Neither mainstream left-wing nor mainstream right-wing politics are the solution. Still, it's not inherently bad to observe politics, just as it's not inherently bad to observe more or less anything, so long as you don't get so drawn into it that create a strong self-image out of it, or you start thinking that half of humanity is evil or stupid and need to change their opinions. After all, people are divine fractals of Source and are infinitely loved by Source, even if those people happen to be wrong or acting destructively. And if people are acting destructively, then they generally need love and connection, because usually people don't act destructively if they feel loved and connected. From my point of view, this is one mistake that Earth humans sometimes make. They say, politics shouldn't be discussed, it lowers your vibration or creates division, or it has no place in the new world we're going to. From my point of view, it's fine to observe or seek to understand politics, so long as you don't get so drawn into it that you become judgmental, or that you create a strong self-image based on a political belief. After all, it is an important part of the world, and where's the harm in seeking to understand the world? Now sure, if you are unable to observe politics without getting drawn in or becoming judgmental, maybe it's best to not observe it. But observing or seeking to understand something isn't inherently harmful, even if said thing is not very high vibration. So should you personally observe politics? As always, your own soul or intuition can answer that question. From my personal perspective, the level of consciousness on Earth has been relatively low for a long period of time, which meant that a large number of people would lie and steal and cheat and abuse others and abuse nature if they can get away with it. In turn, that meant that the only viable economic systems on Earth had pretty huge downsides too. Living in small tribes meant that you got abused or bullied or controlled by large nations. And I don't need to tell you what the problems are with either late-stage crony capitalism, or with Soviet-style communism. Trying to re-implement those systems, only correctly this time, isn't the best solution from my personal point of view, although of course Earth humans are free to make their own choices. Fortunately, the energy and consciousness on Earth keeps rising. Right now the level of consciousness is finally high enough, and people have become so disgusted with the status quo, that non-coercive systems like contributionism or voluntarism have just about started to become viable. I think this will be a huge step up from the current economic systems. If you feel called, you can make a huge contribution to humanity by creating communities that work with those non-coercive economic systems. Although at the start, you might still be required to be critical of who you allow to enter that system, in order to keep out those who would abuse the system. In time humanity's consciousness will be high enough that you can let in anyone, but right now we're at the point where non-coercive systems have only barely become viable from a consciousness standpoint. The beauty of such non-coercive systems is that they can unite the left and the right. The left will be happy that if, for example, people become ill, then the community takes care of them. The right will be happy that these systems are non-coercive. Don't be too quick to think voluntarism or contributionism doesn't work because humans are selfish. Humanity now is much different, consciousness-wise, than it was even just a few months ago. Plus there's a lot of automation technology and other technology out there that when properly harnessed can mean that a lot of menial or unpleasant work simply doesn't need to be done anymore, which also makes these systems run much more smoothly. Alternatively, you can also contribute through raising your level of consciousness, which automatically uplifts the collective subconscious, which will make such systems even more viable and appealing to the average person. So if you want to fix politics, go meditate. Many Earth humans are being incredibly courageous and are either standing up to corrupt authorities, or are indeed going inwards and finding their inner light. Despite the chaos all around, things on Earth are actually moving in the right direction. I know it may not seem like that, and I empathize with your suffering, but the consciousness of Earth humans is a critical variable and it keeps rising. This was my message for today. My biggest hope today is that once humans understand this, believe the chief pattern, it stops having as much power over humanity as it currently does. Because from my point of view, this unresolved ancestral trauma has done more than enough damage already. Your star brother, Hakann.